Capstone project, we will be discussing the addiction of gambling. So the title of my presentation is From Blackjack to Behind Bars. For my thesis, gambling addiction can lead to a path of financial ruin, criminal activity, and incarceration as a gambler tries to continue the game or recover from their losses. And then just to give you some background information, in case you don't know what gambling is defined as the practice or activity of betting, the practice of risking money or other stakes in a game or bet. The first thing I would like to talk about here is the Mark Candelaria case. And so this is actually a criminal case. So what happened here was in September of 2021, Candelaria, along with a co-conspirator, staged a home invasion robbery of his father-in-law. And ultimately, what they were trying to achieve here was money. So the co-conspirator held the father-in-law at gunpoint to get him to open his safe. When he was unable to open his safe, he made him write a check for $23,000. And then he also did assault father-in-law. So the father-in-law was found later and brought into the hospital with pretty extensive injuries. Now, when Candelaria went to deposit this check into his bank account, there was obviously some red flags raised. There was multiple handwritings on this check, and then they also notified the father-in-law's wife, who then also verified that this was fraud. Um, so they obviously were not able to obtain any money from this situation. Then in October of 2021, he proceeded to rob a bank to try to obtain more money. He kind of staged as like a cartel member and just really terrified the teller at the bank. And so he was able to obtain money. And that kind of really led to him being sentenced. He was sentenced to 26 years. And the base of all of this really was the fact that he had a gambling addiction. He visited the casino 169 times between September of 2020 and May of 2022. So he really just needed money to continue to fuel his gambling addiction, which led him to criminal activity. He now, in kind of the eyes of everyone, would be considered a deviant. And it's unfortunate because really he was just kind of a high risk person to kind of fall into a life of crime due to his gambling addiction. So just a really unfortunate situation all around. He was sentenced to 26 years. So, that just kind of can show you the role that addiction can lead a person to end up. This is a picture of him from the bank robbery that was obtained obviously from their security cameras. So these are just some statistics that I would like to talk about. There's obviously a wide variety of ways that we could take these statistics, but I would just kind of like to talk about who is most susceptible to kind of falling into a life of gambling addiction. So men actually outweigh women 2 to 1 among people with gambling addictions. So it's pretty predominant that men are more likely to struggle with this. And then people in their 20s are actually the fastest growing group of gamblers. And then minorities are often found to be at higher risk, with Black/African Americans and then Native/Asian Americans being kind of right there at the top. And then almost 50% less than that would be white/Caucasians. And then China actually has the most gambling addicts in the world. So they're kind of found to be really up there in addiction with that. Another thing that I would kind of like to touch on is theft and fraud. And now these are obviously going to take gambling from just being an activity that people can do into more criminal activity. So this is usually where we see gambling addicts kind of head into that criminal lifestyle, is going to be they are having a hard time continuing to fuel their addiction. So that leads them to committing theft. Kind of going back to the case that I had mentioned, he staged a home invasion robbery and robbed a bank in order to get money. So those were both instances of theft. And the biggest thing of this is just pressure really starts to kind of weigh down on these people. You know, a lot of times they're in mass amounts of debt. They've lost a lot of money at this point, but they just need that fix. They just have that mindset of, I'm going to get my big win, I'm going to get my big break. And so they just keep gambling and gambling. And a lot of times it just continues to downward spiral. And so there actually is something kind of called the fraud triangle, which links pressure, opportunity, and rationalization as to why people gamble. And pressure is one where, you know, people really have the societal pressures of wanting to be successful. They want that wealth, they want that status symbol of looking like they have it all together. And so that's kind of where it all continues to go. And it just, yeah, it spirals out of control. Um, so it's kind of the strain theory, you know, where we put that pressure to achieve those societal goals. Um, So I'm just going to read a little quote here. Compulsive or pathological gamblers are those who sooner or later suffer heavy losses, often $100 or more at a time, borrow or steal money or write bad checks to pay gambling debts, avoid or cannot pay their own gambling bills, and lie to their families, friends, and therapists about the extent of their gambling. So this really does lead back to that case that I was talking about, you know, where he tried to steal money to pay for his gambling debts and could not afford his own gambling bills. And then obviously his family must not have known what was going on due to the fact that he robbed his father-in-law. So it just took over his whole life. And then some social institutions that are kind of tie into our gambling addiction is going to be families. So like I said, um, kind of touching back to that case with his family, it can lead to a lot of financial stress. These people really are almost living double lifestyles where their family has no idea how severe the situation is. And it can also lead to neglect of their family. The gambling addiction itself kind of becomes the most important thing in their life. And then with that stress and pressure that's being put on them, a lot of times it can cause them to snap and they can become abusive, and whether that be emotionally abusive or physically abusive, that's not uncommon. Um, Another piece is going to be that economy. And while gambling, in the eyes of a bigger picture of the economy, is a good thing, you know, it helps with tourism, it helps with jobs. Casinos obviously employ a lot of people. There is a lot of negative effects that come with it. People who gamble often find themselves kind of falling low. They end up kind of going down to a lower class because they've lost everything. They have to file for bankruptcy or just lose all their money. They end up in mass amounts of debt. So it's not always a great thing, while in the eyes of a bigger economy picture, it can be. It's definitely not something that is all the time. It also leads to poor mental health. So that ties into our healthcare here, where gambling addiction is actually related to a mental health problem. And that requires obviously more resources being used by our healthcare system. And then another piece kind of to tie in is going to be that religion aspect. Now, it's, I think, pretty commonly known that religions don't support gambling. It's not seen as something good in their eyes. They really kind of have those values that instill not to gamble, not to have the addiction that comes with that. So those are all social institutions that kind of tie into gambling. And then I just wanted to touch on conflict theory. So, what happens with gambling that we find is it's usually marketed to very vulnerable populations. A lot of times it's marketed to people of lower socioeconomic classes, especially when you think of things like winning the lottery. Lottery tickets, a lot of times, are marketed to those lower classes, people who um, aren't always able to make ends meet, or you know, are living paycheck to paycheck and what have you. They spend their money that they may not really have to be frivolously spending on those lottery tickets just for a very, very small chance that they're going to win all of this money. And it's pretty common that casinos are like that as well. They're found in usually places where there is a bit of a lower class situation. So there's definitely just that conflict of wanting people to end up with that success. They think that they are going to be those lucky ones. They think that they're going to have that chance to succeed. And so the marketing of gambling kind of preys on that mindset. Now, there isn't really any human rights that are violated with gambling. If anything, a lot of these human rights give people the freedom to be able to gamble. You know, gambling isn't something that's a right, but it is something that we are able to exercise the right to the freedom of being able to do. So, reading through them, there wasn't any that I found that really is specifically tied into gambling. It's just mostly we have the availability to do so, and we are lucky and privileged to be able to have that. Now, the discussion question that I would like to pose here is, at what point does gambling cross over from being socially acceptable to making someone a deviant? And who do you think gets to decide this? So, just something to kind of ponder there after kind of talking this over. What really changes the script? Where, at what point do we draw the line and say, you know what, you are casually just doing this as a fun activity, whether you're playing poker around the table with your friends or you go to the casino here or there, to, okay, now this is becoming an addiction. It's a problem. Is there a dollar amount that kind of finalizes that? Okay, you're in this much debt, or you've gone to the casino this many times. And who does get to decide that? Is that something person themselves, family, the government? What draws that line? And then these are just my references. So I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me talk about this issue that we're seeing really globally. And thank you.